När det gäller klimat, som vi ska prata om mer idag, så jobbar vi med klimatkartläggning av utsläpp genom hela värdekedjan. Beräkning av dessa och sättande av science-based targets och framtagning av åtgärder och handlingsplaner just för att nå de önskade målen. Och hållbarhetsfrågor är ju mångdimensionerade som ni vet, men just idag kommer vi sätta lite extra fokus på klimatfrågan. Och då i kontext av vad företag åtar sig för att minska sina utsläpp och sin påverkan på klimatet. Nu kommer jag lämna över till min kollega Alva. Och hon kommer då dra en genomgång av lite bakgrund och behovet till den här Net-Zam Standarden. Varsågod Alva.
Tack så mycket. Ska vi se. Ja, varför behövs då Science-Based Targets Net-Zam Standard? Vi kan börja med att koppla till IPCCs rapport, och den senaste rapporten från IPCC visar att brådskande förändringar krävs idag. Och kraftiga snabba utsläppsminskningar behövs för att minimera temperaturökningen, som är mycket avgörande för miljön, biologisk mångfald, luftkvaliteten och fortsatt liv på jorden. Människans påverkan på klimatet är inte längre argumenterbart, då människans utsläpp av fossila gaser i IPCCs rapport konstateras som den huvudsakliga orsaken som driver på klimatförändringar. Så ansvaret är såklart fördelat på oss som individer, men företag och industrier måste nu ha extra stort ansvar att vända kurvan. Vi riskerar att passera 1,5-gradersmålet inom 10-20 år, och vi närmar oss tröskeleffekter med större risker och oåterkalleliga effekter. Till exempel, några sådana är ett smältandet av Arktis istäcke och glaciärer och upptining av permafrost som skulle frigöra ofantliga mängder växthusgaser i atmosfären. Så behovet då är drastiska och mycket stora. Och behovet ser vi också har besvarats. Många företag har kommit med utsläppsreducerande åtgärder och kommunicerar också om de här. Vi ser runt omkring oss företag som beskriver klimatneutrala produkter, eller att företaget är klimatneutralt. Men vad betyder det egentligen? Företag använder också olika definitioner och uttryck för klimatneutralitet i sin marknadsföring, vilket kan vara svårtolkat och svårt för konsumenter att navigera på marknaden. Konsumentverket har därför gått ut med ett PM i april förra året som tryckte på vikten av att just underbygga och förklara påståenden som till exempel klimatkompenserad, klimatneutral eller netto-noll klimattryck i sin marknadsföring, just för att tydliggöra för kunderna vad de menar med de här begreppen. Om ni vill läsa mer om de här miljöpåståendena så kan ni göra det på Konsumentverkets PM som jag har länkat där i slutet av presentationen. Så hur kan företag jobba med Net-Zam på ett trovärdigt sätt framåt? Science-Based Target Initiatives standard för Net-Zam har kommit med en tydlig och vetenskaplig definition av Net-Zam i linje med Parisavtalet. Vi vill såklart tydliggöra och vara öppna med att det finns många sätt att på ett trovärdigt sätt tydliggöra sina klimatpåståenden. Men Science-Based Target Initiative ger en lösning till det här. Net-Zam-standarden erbjuder ett tydligt och motiverat ramverk för att beskriva hur ditt företag med grund i vetenskapen kan jobba mot Net-Zam. Därför vill vi introducera standarden till er och reda ut eventuella frågor kring den. Så nu är det dags att introducera Emma, vilket innebär att vi kommer att gå över till att hålla presentationen på engelska. So we are very pleased to be able to introduce Emma Watson today. Emma is the Senior Net-Zam Manager at CDP and is leading the development of the corporate Net-Zam Standard. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Emma. It's very early for you. It's 7 in the morning for you in the UK. You will walk us through a presentation of the Net-Zam Standard. And I'm so happy to hand over to you, Emma. So I will just lead the slides and you will just let me know when to move forward.
Cool, thank you very much. So hello everyone, good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be talking to you guys about the Net-Zam Standards. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please, or can I control them? No.
No.
Okay, great. Cool. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, please. So today, the agenda that I wanted to walk you through was, first of all, just an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I won't go into too much detail here, but just a brief overview. I then wanted to talk about the Net-Zam Standard development process, so a bit of the background onto why we developed the Net-Zam Standard, and also just very briefly touch on the process. I will then take you through what a science-based net zero target is under the SBTi's net zero standard framework. We'll then go through a beyond value chain mitigation explainer. So we've introduced this new kind of term, beyond value chain mitigation, since the standard was most recently launched. So previously we were using a different terminology. One of those was compensation, which you may be familiar with. So I just wanted to walk you through that, as that's a really fast moving space. I'll then talk about some of the resources that are available and how companies can then actually commit to setting net zero targets through the SBTi. So thank you very much. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative was formed in 2015 in advance of the Paris climate talk. So at that point, companies didn't know how to translate the global climate goals into something that they could implement themselves. So essentially, we were formed to help answer that question, and we are made up of 4 different NGOs, so colleagues from 4 different NGOs. I am based out of CDP's London office, but I work with colleagues from the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute and WWF, and we also work quite closely with the We Mean Business Coalition as well. So if we go, yes, great. So we've had quite a lot of, oh, sorry, back one, please. So we've had quite a lot of momentum since we were formed in 2015, and I think probably much more than we had expected. Sorry, Alpha, could we go back just one slide? Oh, yes, perfect, thank you. No, sorry. The one that says progress today, yes, this one, perfect. So yeah, so we've now have over 2,000 companies. We crossed the 2,000 threshold, I think probably in September last year, and we now have 2,356 companies that are part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and just under half of those, the 1,108, have already had their targets approved. So the rest are just committed to setting science-based targets. Those 1,108 already have gone through the validation process. We also have 1,178 companies that are part of the Business Ambition for 1.5C campaign. And those companies have essentially either committed to setting net zero targets or aligning all 3 scopes of their emission reductions to 1.5C. So every year we publish a progress report, is what you see on the left. So our progress report for 2021 is not out yet. It's being written at the moment, but there you can see the impact that Science-Based Targets is having and how companies are actually reducing their emissions. Great, so if we can go on to the next slide, please. I think there was one more after that, or before that, sorry, the one that we had previously, or maybe it's in, sorry, no, or maybe it was before the progress to date one, that one, before? The one with the, yes, this one, sorry, okay, so the order, I've got confused with the order. Next slide, yeah. And then we'll skip on. Okay, great. So what are science-based targets? So I mentioned that the SBTi was formed to help companies translate Paris temperature goals into something that they could implement themselves. So essentially, very simply, science-based targets help companies to determine how much and how fast they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to align efforts with limiting warming to 1.5C. So previously, companies were allowed, and still actually are allowed, to set targets in line with well below 2C, which is the Paris goal. We've ramped up our ambition to 1.5C for all companies starting in July next year. So more and more we're going to be moving towards the 1.5C. And currently these targets are based on 5 to 15 years, but also moving from a shorter to a shorter time frame of 5 to 10 years. To align with the momentum that's needed to halve global emissions by 2030. Great, okay, if we go on to the next section, please, thank you, Alma. So just to take a step back a bit, I unfortunately don't understand Swedish, but I know Alva talked about the science behind some of the kind of why of the net zero standard. But just to put it in very simple terms, so we're currently in a state of imbalance between the greenhouse gases that humans emit and the removals that we use to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So essentially, where we want to be is we want to be at the image on the right-hand side of the slide, where greenhouse gas emissions are very dramatically reduced to near zero, and then they're balanced with carbon dioxide removals. So very simply, that's what we were trying to achieve. And if you think back to when the Science-Based Targets Initiative was formed, we were trying to answer, how can companies align with temperature goals in the short term? And similarly, we're trying to understand in the net zero standard development process how companies can go from what's shown on the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side. So translating that into something companies can implement. And as I mentioned previously, we are much more focused on the temperature goal of 1.5C as being the maximum that we really should be aiming for. We don't have much time left to achieve it. So in order for us to get that, we have to reach this state of net zero carbon emissions by no later than 2050. If we go on to the next slide, please. So, and then thinking about why we have developed the net zero standard.
I'm sorry, I just have to say, there seems like someone is having their microphone turned on, so please make sure you have it muted. Thank you. Please continue.
Thanks, Alva. So another reason why the SBTi developed the net zero standard was that there was a huge momentum around the concept of net zero, and that really started when the IPCC released its special report on 1.5C in 2018. So that's when the concept of net zero and the push towards 1.5C really, I guess, gained a lot of momentum. And since then, we have seen a lot of different types of actors taking on net zero targets. So if you see on the left-hand side, this image is from November 2021, so it may have been updated, but this is from the Energy and Carbon Intelligence Unit. They have a net zero tracker, so they look at all of the commitments, not necessarily looking at the whether they're aligned to the standard or not, just all of the net zero commitments. And in November, they covered emissions, or 88% of emissions, and 90% of GDP. So it's a huge amount of coverage of net zero targets. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the massive growth in the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign. So this shows the growth from June until September of last year. And there's a huge amount of different actors taking part in the Race to Zero. But the biggest chunk that you'll see there is the kind of light purple. And those are companies. So companies are really getting behind the concept of net zero. But despite that, there isn't really, or there wasn't really at the time, a framework for companies to do that and to make sure that their targets were credible. So we go on to the next slide, please. And then finally, we did some research before starting off the development process, and we found that there was a lot of criticism around the concept of net zero, and that was because the lack of consistency and the fact that there wasn't really a robust benchmark. So this is a question that we get a lot, is, you know, how can companies, is it something that companies still want to do to commit to net zero when there's a lot of bad press around it and things like that? But we've tried to solve some of these issues through the Net-Zam Standard. So I won't go through these in detail, but I think the top two are probably that net zero targets can allow delayed action. So, you know, having a net zero by 2050 target with nothing behind it, it can just be seen as greenwashing. And also, there's been a lot of criticism around net zero in the past because it would allow companies just to offset emissions instead of actually reducing them. So we tried to solve for some of these, or for all of these issues within the net zero standard. Great. Now, if we go on to the next slide, please. And just to go very briefly around the process. So I've included a link to our website which talks about the process. It was a 2-year process actually, but from a public-facing perspective, we started in September 2020. We had 2 public consultations throughout, which had a huge amount of interest, and we had a lot of response to that. We did go through a road testing process with 84 companies last summer to kind of get feedback, and then we launched just before COP on the 28th of October. Another thing that I should mention is that we worked very closely with our expert advisory group to support the Net Zero Standard development process. So that was a group of 42 experts from different areas related to the topic. So civil society, academia, business. So they were really our sounding board to help make sure that this was really credible. But it was a huge we had a huge amount of interest and feedback, and a huge amount of stakeholders that took part. So there's the 42 experts, but we also had our scientific advisory group, our technical advisory group, all of the people that took part in the road test and the public consultation. So we calculated that to be at least 800 different participants taking part in the process. So it's a big team effort. Great. So now, if we go on to the next slide, just very quickly. So through that road testing process, we did actually manage to validate 7 companies. So these are just these companies already have net zero targets, and we have officially just began validating the next batch of targets as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please, I'll walk you through what a science-based net zero target is under the SBTi's Net Zero Standard framework. Great. So the first element that makes up a company's net zero target is their near-term science-based target. So this is essentially your regular science-based target that companies have been setting for the last 7 years. However, we've added this new term, near-term, to make it more specific within the context of net zero targets. So this is exactly the same as I showed on the first slide. It's a 5 to 10 year emission reduction target that's in line with 1.5C. So that's important because companies wanting to set net zero targets now, although the SBTi in general will still accept well below 2C targets until July next year, if companies want to set net zero targets now and before July, their science-based targets in the near term have to be in line with 1.5C. So that's just a prerequisite of being able to set net zero targets. If we go on to the next slide, please. So the second element of a net zero target is the long-term science-based target. So this is essentially what shows companies how much they need to be reducing their emissions to be in line with global net zero scenarios. So that is what's often called the residual emissions. So figuring out what are the residual emissions that are left when the company reaches net zero. So this target, it's actually target year independent. So it tells you what that residual level of emissions is. And then you would decide, okay, I think I can achieve those emission reductions by 2050, 2040, whatever it is that makes sense for your business and whatever your strategy allows for. So that will be the latest 2050 though. For most companies, this is going to require them to reduce emissions by 90% or more. So we're actually looking at reducing your emissions to almost near zero, particularly in the electricity sector. But we're trying to reduce emissions as much as possible before actually reaching net zero. You can't just balance emissions out now with carbon removals because there isn't the capacity there to do that. So we have to reduce emissions to that level. The third element is a recommendation, not a requirement. However, companies are increasingly expected to go beyond their science targets to mitigate emissions outside of their value chains. So this is where companies, where you would think, where many people think of offsetting, this is where that sits. So the kind of compensation, the removals, that sits in this bucket. However, it's a much broader category because there are many actions that companies can take to help reduce emissions outside of their value chains, but you can't necessarily put, a ton for ton on it. They could be contributing to projects that just don't have that, but are essential for our transition to net zero. However, some of the things that companies could do would be to purchase high quality jurisdictional RED+ credits, or invest in direct air capture and storage, which needs to be scaled up. So there is, I'll talk about this more later on the presentation because it's quite complicated. And then finally, when a company reaches its long-term science-based target, it's then required to neutralize any emissions that remain with carbon removals. So they then have to be balanced and then stored permanently as well. Great. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the beyond value chain mitigation explainer. So on the last slide, this was the third element of the science-based target. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to talk about some of the terminology and try and visualize it slightly because it can get very complicated and we've made some changes. So we talk a lot about mitigation, abatement, beyond value chain mitigation, and that type of thing. So mitigation essentially is a catch-all term for any human intervention that we take to reduce emissions or enhance sink. So pretty much everything that we do in the climate change space, we're trying to mitigate emissions. So it's an umbrella term. We then talk about abatement. So abatement is reducing emissions within your own value chain. So you can see that there with the red. Then we have beyond value chain abatement. So this is anything that a company does outside of its own value chain to help reduce emissions. And it can also be removals, it can be avoided emissions as well as reduced. So it's a catch-all term. Compensation is listed here on the slide. So this is legacy terminology, but it's a term that we use in the foundations paper, which came out in September 2020, but it's gained quite a lot of popularity. However, we found actually that during the development process that the term compensation essentially implies that that a company is making up for what they're doing and that it's equal and balances, but essentially it's not necessarily the case, and there was a lot of negative feedback around that word, so we've removed that terminology. So, but those were that was a term that was used to describe any actions to avoid or reduce emissions rather than remove emissions. And then neutralization. So this is, I had this on the previous slide, but these are measures that companies take to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere to balance remaining emissions. So it uses removals, but the action of neutralization is kind of the balancing that happens at the end. So hopefully that makes sense, but just, I guess, to reiterate, the beyond value chain mitigation is a catch-all term for anything that companies doing beyond its science-based target. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So we have focused the net zero standard essentially on abatement and how companies need to reduce their value chain emissions to achieve net zero. So that's really the first thing that a company should be doing, is to focus on their greenhouse gas emissions, to set science-based targets, figure out their climate strategy, and then start getting to work on that. However, there's increasingly a need for companies to go beyond their science-based target and help accelerate that change towards net zero within society. It's going to take a lot more than just companies setting science-based targets, unfortunately. So we are currently conducting further research to inform our approach in this area. So it's a recommendation for companies at the moment to do this, but we've just provided some very light touch guidance. And we're trying to figure out how we can best incentivize companies to make them want to do this. So that's kind of something that we'll be expecting to put more information out into the space within the coming months. A final point to say is that at the moment, we're not specifying too much on the eligible neutralization activities. We get a lot of questions about that. The reason for that is because the frameworks for assessing how permanent these removals are really, they're still immature, and there's a lot of work being done in this space by others. So we are aware that this is kind of, for most companies, I think that, the earliest it's going to be is till 2030, although we do have to plan to, of course, scale up these removals. But at the moment, it's hard for us to put any, very strong criteria around that, because it could quite easily change. So we're still continuing our work in that area as well. Great. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So these are some examples of different things that companies could do, and just to bring this a bit more to life. So this slide highlights, I guess, that companies should focus on abatement, but of course they're increasingly expected to go beyond their science-based targets. What's perhaps interesting is that I think in the past, many companies actually used to not focus on their own value chains and focus on things outside of their value chains. Then it kind of switched, I suppose, to value chain emission reduction through science-based targets. But now it's kind of a both exercise, is that companies need to go through an increasing pressure to address the climate crisis. So we have split this up into actions that companies could take to reduce emissions on top, or to remove emissions on the bottom. So here you can see some examples, and they are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list at all. There's many more things that companies can do, but just some examples. So within the value chain, I mentioned that companies abate emissions. So essentially that's when they emit less greenhouse gases, and that could be through using new technologies, switching to renewable energy, more sustainable transport, that type of thing. Outside of the value chain, this could look like preventing deforestation, or giving finance to different projects or technologies that reduce emissions. When we're talking about removing emissions, so you can see there on the bottom, to neutralize any residual emissions, some examples of this could be direct air capture and storage, enhanced weathering, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, afforestation, coastal blue carbon, and other approaches that are still being developed. So these are some of the options. As I mentioned, we do require that these removals are permanent, and we expect that, you know, this is going to develop over time. So we just wanted to show companies what this looks like, but we don't have very strict criteria around this at the moment. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So if you're interested in finding out more on this topic, I've realized that it's quite complex, very fast moving space. So we have developed a Beyond Value Chain Mitigation FAQ, which is on our website. This document is intended to be a live document, so we will update it over time. So if you are looking at it and maybe referring to it over time, I'd recommend going to the website and checking out on there rather than downloading and saving as a PDF and only referring to the current version. So within the FAQ, we do point to other useful resources in the interim while we are figuring out how to provide more guidance. So the first resource that we point to is the WWF Beyond Science-Based Targets Blueprint for Corporate Action. So this shows companies how they can use carbon pricing to raise money for additional mitigation. There's the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. This is really, really in-depth guidance about quality of carbon credits. The LEAF Coalition. So the LEAF Coalition is a coalition that aims to mobilize finance to tropical forests. So we have pointed to them because they are very strict on the mitigation hierarchy and making sure that companies are doing their own emission reductions first before they actually accept any money. So they realize that companies need to be doing that first before they move towards outside of the value chain mitigation action. So that's a good one to look at if you actually want to start making those investments. And then there's also the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute and the SEI have published this Securing Climate Benefits document, and this is published on offsetguide.org. And it has a huge amount of different resource for companies to understand offsetting and carbon credits and the different approaches to take as well. Cool. So that's that slide. So if we move on to the next one, please. So very quickly, what resources are available? So if we go on to the next slide, please. So just to start off, I suppose, understanding which companies can use the Net Zero Standard. So in general, companies with over 500 employees that wish to commit to net zero, they can use it. SMEs can also use it. So we define SMEs as companies with less than 500 employees. They can use the Net Zero Standard for information. However, there is a much more simplified route for SMEs. So they will not have to deal with all of the complexity that comes with the Net Zero Standard. It does not apply to financial institutions. Financial institutions, they have a separate Net Zero Standard development process, which is ongoing. The foundation's paper is currently open for comment. And so they'll probably launch the standards and begin validating targets at the end of this year. However, saying that, they'll use a lot of the same principles. And if you're a financial institution and you're encouraging your portfolio to set science-based targets, to set net zero targets, your portfolio companies would then follow the Net Zero Standard. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing that financial institutions can do now. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So where to find key resources? So our website is always going to be the best place to find our resources. So that is sciencebasedtargets.org. And then you can go to the main menu, click on resources, you scroll down a little bit, and then you will find all of the different resources which are, I guess, categorized into 5 different buckets. So commit, develop, submit, learn, and background. So sometimes maybe things aren't in the category that you expect, so just have a look around and see what you can find. But all of our resources, including any translations, are available there on our website. The Net-Zero resources also available on the Net-Zero page as well, but this is kind of everything that you would need to find. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So there are 4 key resources for companies to set net zero targets. The first is the Getting Started guide. So if you haven't had a look at any of the materials yet, this is where I would begin. So this is a much more visual and kind of easier to understand version of the manual, so it should be a good starting point. The next is, of course, the Net-Zam Standard. So that's the big document. It has the criteria, the guidance, the recommendations to help companies to set net zero targets. And then there's also a standalone criteria document. So that is included within the Net-Zam Standard, but if you just want to look at the criteria, you can just download that or look at that on our website. We also have a tool to help companies to set net zero targets. So once you're ready to actually do the calculations, this is where you will look. In the future, it will be combined with our regular science-based target setting tool, but at the moment it's just a standalone tool that you would use specifically for net zero. Great. And if you're interested in the more technical detail and the science behind the Net-Zam Standard, I'd first point you towards the Net-Zero Foundations paper. So I mentioned that that was published in September 2020. So that has the foundations for all of the work that we did, some of the questions that we're trying to answer, and goes into the science in more detail and the different options and how companies were setting net zero targets. So a lot of it is, most of it is still valid, and it's an interesting read. And then the Pathways to Net Zero document, that was published when we launched the Net-Zam Standard. So it's a very interesting piece of work that we worked with our scientific advisory group on, and it has some very impressive co-authors. And essentially it talks about how we select the different mitigation pathways and make sure that the work that we're doing is staying within the carbon budgets. So that's something that you can look at if you're interested. And then if we go on to the next slide, please. So we began validating net zero targets in January the 10th. We have started using a validation booking system. We are extremely booked up. So as of Monday, we were booked until 2023, which is, although exciting from a kind of climate action perspective, we realise that's very frustrating for companies. So we are working very, very hard to increase resource within the team. We, just to give you a bit of an idea, we had 3 times the interest that we normally do just before, when we launched the booking system. So it was unexpected. We are working very hard to make sure that those dates come forward. So if you are looking to have your targets validated, I would book in, and then hopefully we'll be able to move those dates forward for you. Great, and then I think that might be it. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was helpful, and great speaking to you today.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Emma. Now we're going to know a lot more about the practicalities in the terms of setting the science-based targets, so that's super good. And now it's time for our questions, but before that I just want to remind you that we are going to stop recording now. So don't be afraid to raise your hand and ask Emma directly if you rather do that, and we will just give you